If I'm live, I don't realize I'm live. 1 second. Okay. I think we're live. Hopefully we're live. I'm going to say I'm live. Hello, and thank you for tuning in today for our live chat and our live experiment for you guys. If you're not watching it live, hopefully y'all will be able to tune in a little bit later, maybe this afternoon on your wild Wednesday night, and you need something to do for an hour and get some extra hours in for the STEM Institute before the deadline of May 4th this weekend. All right. Willie says I'm live, so I'm good. Thanks, Willie. So my name is Sami Dupnik. Most of you, I'm assuming, already know me. I am the STEM Teacher Institute coordinator this year, and I've had the privilege to learn and explore and teach you guys all different kinds of stuff this school year. And as we're coming to an end and wrapping up the year of Earth Science, I wanted to do some experiments with you all that will be super easy to do and implement into your classroom in a variety of age levels and grade levels that covers a lot of different topics and as well is really current and applicable to where we live in North Texas, especially in the DFW area. So that's actually what inspired me. I really like to try to do science and apply it to real world situations, especially ones that are applicable to my own life or my students' life or whoever I'm talking to's life. And here in Dallas, if you've lived here long enough or even just 1 year and experienced a springtime here when the weather conditions and atmospheric conditions are just right, we get a lot of rain. And all of that rain, if you're trying to drive to work in the morning or try to drive home or sometimes in your backyard or even in your own house, you might be experiencing some flooding. Flooding is one of Dallas's most common natural disasters and a true engineering project and ongoing problem in the city. And we're going to explore why we experience so much flooding here in Dallas. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with the amount of rain. Many of you have probably noticed, I know I have, that even just a little storm that lasts maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes rolls through the city. And when you leave for work that day, the roads and the highways are already flooded just from a little bit of rain. There's actually a geologic reason for that, and that's what we're going to be exploring today with our stream table models. So some of you guys have probably made stream table models before or seen those really big, huge stream table models that are hooked up to water pumps, and you can control the velocity of your water and have all kinds of really cool interactive things, which are amazing, but they're also really expensive. So there's some really cool DIY ways to incorporate these into your classroom that get your students' hands in the mix, getting a little dirty, because that's what geology is. And you can explore a lot of different properties of streams and rivers and different flooding conditions and model what actually is happening in our own city, in our own backyard. So the main river that flows through DFW is the Trinity River. So the Trinity River is a classic meandering stream. And we're going to be covering some different vocabulary words today. Some might be super familiar with them. Others might be brand new terms that you've never heard before. And we're going to explore what all of those mean, how they apply to river systems, and then we're going to be modeling some different flooding conditions and exploring what happens with inside and outside of a river and how that might affect people living around it. Now, this is a problem for a lot of communities in the world because where there is water, there are people. So historically, civilizations have followed where the water is. Water is an incredibly important resource here on Earth, especially fresh water. Rivers happen to be a very plentiful, beautiful place to live with plenty of access to water, as well as transportation. And what we'll explore a little bit later is that they actually create really great landscapes for agriculture to grow food. So people have been living near water sources for all of human history. So if you look at a global map in the past where cities used to be, and a global map today, you'll see most big cities are going to be situated along coastlines, along rivers, in areas where there is plenty of water available. So it's a really important issue because flooding and different flooding conditions are going to affect a lot of people depending on where they're living. So that's what we're going to be exploring today. If you were to build a house on a river system, where along that river would you want to build it? So that's what we're going to be exploring today. But before we can get modeling anything, we have to kind of dissect what a river or a stream is and understand all of its different parts. That way we can build it and we can make our observations about what happens during different flooding conditions. So that's what we're going to do first. So I'm going to zoom you guys in over to my screen here. Hopefully you guys can see it. So we have our anatomy of a stream. Now, when geologists are talking about the anatomy of different landforms, we're actually talking about the morphology. So the morphology of a stream. Today, our stream is the same thing as a river. So all rivers are considered streams. Now, there are many different types of rivers, but the most common and the one that the Trinity River is categorized as is a meandering stream. So a meander is simply just that S shape in your river or your stream system, which we're going to be sketching after I explain to you the model that I've created, and then we'll actually build a separate model before we run our experiments. So a meandering stream simply just means our S or snake-shaped river system or stream system. And you can see the water is going to be flowing along these paths. So in order for there to be a river with flowing water, you have to have a source of your water. Most water is going to be sourced upstream because what we probably all know is that in a river system, water flows from upstream to downstream. Typically, this is going to be following topography. So most water sources are going to be coming from a higher elevation. So whether that is snow and ice melt from a mountain range or higher elevations locally. It all kind of depends. Our channel is going to be the part of the river system that our water is actually flowing through. And we're going to dissect what the channel looks like and some things happening inside of the channel a little bit later. The mouth of our stream is where the water empties into. So this is the most downstream part of our river. We're going to be exploring some different landforms that are created in these mouth environments and why they're created there and what's actually happening. What's the physics behind these different landforms and how they're created. Typically, streams are going to be, their mouth is going to be emptying out into a larger body of water. So if we think of our stream as a hose, and our mouth is going to be emptying up into our pool, okay? So a larger body of water. And that change of volume is going to affect how and why we see different landforms at the mouth compared to other parts of the stream. Levees, which a lot of you living in DFW probably are familiar with this term. There are a lot of man-made levees along the Trinity River, and we're going to explore the differences between man-made and natural levees, their purposes for each of them, and how they can affect each other, and why they're so important. So levees are going to be areas of higher topography parallel to the channel on either side of your stream channel. And we're going to explore those a little bit later as well. Our floodplain, which most of you in DFW are also probably familiar with because most of the Metroplex is built on a floodplain. Our floodplain is going to be our flat, low-lying areas on either side of our levees, which are paralleling our channel. And then we've already explored what a meander is. Each meander in a river system is going to be one U-shaped bend in our river. So our river here that I just drew has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 meanders, all right, which will be important when we're building our models later and exploring the different parts of the meander. So I can sit here and list words for you all day, but what's better is to actually sketch out and draw what we're looking at. So I'm going to be sketching. Let me just make sure, yep, we're still good. I'm going to be sketching both a bird's eye view or a map view of our river channel with all of the different morphological parts or components to it. And we're also going to be looking at a cross-sectional view. Cross-section just means if you were to slice your river channel in half and look at it in the direction that the water would be flowing towards you, that's going to be our cross-sectional view. So up here, I'm going to have some beautiful mountains with some snow on top, and we've got the sun melting our snow. So up here in these high mountains with our melting snow, I have our H2O source. So this is where our water source for our river system is going to be flowing from. We have our meandering channel that has two sides to it. Okay, so our water is flowing downstream along our meandering channel. Now, this river that I just created here, how many meanders do you think this river has? Remember, each U-shaped in our meandering river system represents one meander. So we have 1, 2, 3 meanders in the river system that I just drew here up on my screen. Now, the next part of our river system, remember, is our levees. So our levees are going to parallel the entire river channel on either side. So if I were to take a slice out of my river along this meander and look at it, remember our cross-sectional view, looking this direction at our river system, looking at the water coming towards us, we would see something, a shape like this. Our water in normal conditions is going to be below the height of the levees, and this is really important. Levees are formations on either side of a river system that actually contain water, okay, and they're there to help prevent flooding, and they're actually formed by flooding events, which is kind of ironic. So our water is flowing towards us, okay? Our levees are on either side, and they're higher than the base of the channel. Now on either side of our levees, the land flattens back out, and these are going to be our floodplains. Now, surprise, surprise, floodplains are called floodplains because they're landforms that are formed during flooding. So our floodplains are going to be all out here. So what happens during a flooding event is we have more water running through our river system that the channel can hold. All right, our channel is a fixed volume. So if there's more water coming through here, eventually it's going to rise and continue to rise. And once it reaches the top of the levee, if it breaches the top of the levee, which means there's so much water that even the levees can't contain it inside of our channel, that water is going to flow out over our levees into our surrounding landscape. As it does that, it carries pieces of rock, which we call sediments, and it deposits it along this low-lying landscape because it loses energy. As water is moving through a channel, it's moving pretty fast. You can think of it as our hose again. We have water running through this confined space. Once water is no longer in that confined space, it's going to lose its energy. Its velocity is going to slow down. So it no longer has enough energy to carry all of these suspended pieces of sediment with it. So that sediment gets dropped out. This sediment is going to include pieces, sand-sized pieces. Sometimes, depending on the severity of the flood, you can have big boulder-sized pieces of sediment that get carried out into a floodplain. But the most dominant size of sediment is going to be our mud and our silt and our sand, which is really important and why river systems are so popular for people to live on, is all of that mud, silt, and sand carries nutrients with it that allow the floodplains on either side of a river system to be extremely fertile. So this means that you can grow a lot of different things near a source of water that you can feed yourself in your communities. Okay, so not only are river systems just a source of water, but because of these landforms associated with them and associated with flooding events, it creates this really habitable place to live until a flood happens. So floodplains are formed by flooding. So our water is moving downstream along our river system, and then at the base, we have our mouth, okay? And remember, the mouth of our river is going to be emptying into some other larger body of water. We'll just call this our lake, or in the case of the Trinity, it could be flowing into another river system, which eventually leads to some larger body of water like the Gulf of Mexico, okay? Or oceans or other lakes. So, as we explore our experiments and model different flooding conditions with our stream tables, we're going to reevaluate this simple sketch that I made, my simple cross-section of my river system. And we're going to make some observations during our experiment and see if this is really what the inside or a cross-sectional view of a river system looks like. Okay, so keep this shape in mind. So, what we are going to get to now is all of our materials that we need for our experiment today. So to create your modeled stream table, it really only requires a couple things. So here we just have simple paint trays that we purchased from a Home Depot or a hardware store. Super cheap. We have got some fine-grained sand. Now, the texture of the sand is actually really important. So fine-grained sand means that it's pretty small. It doesn't have big pebbles or larger pieces of sediment, and all of the pieces are exactly the same size. And this is important for this model because the larger size sediments that we have, if we're building our stream table in this, water is going to be able to move through it easier, which means that our sand won't stick together. The goal for this experiment is to get a texture of sand that is similar to like your most perfect sandcastle sand. So it needs to have a little bit of moisture in it to allow that water tension to have those sand grains kind of stick together. But with too much water, your sand grains are just going to splat out. And with not enough water, your sand grains won't stick together at all. And we'll kind of explore that as I build a new stream table for you to compare it to the one I already have built. And then we'll use both of them for our experiments. So we have our fine-grained sand, very important, and then we've got some water, okay? You're going to want some sort of container to be able to pour your water that kind of has a small directional pour spout to it. And this is important because we want our water to come from our source. We are going to be the source of water in this experiment, so we are the mountains with our melting snow. We want that water to go in a direction that we want it to. If we have something that's too wide, it's just going to spill water out and kind of erode our stream table away. Which reminds me, we're going to get to a couple other terms and geologic processes once we build our stream table, and that's going to be erosion and deposition, which are two really important terms that mean very different things that really affect what happens where along a stream. The last thing that we have are something to represent little houses. So these are just paper clips of different colors so you guys might be able to see them a little easier. I'll zoom in. They're just little paper clips that we can sit into the sand really easily. You could use anything you wanted here. If you actually had little tiny houses, maybe you have a game of Monopoly or Settlers of Catan at home, and you have little play pieces that represent, that actually look like little homes, that works too. In this case, we're just going to be using paper clips to represent our homes. As I remember, our question is, where along a stream is it the best place to live? Okay, there we go. And then, of course, some paper towels to wipe your hands off as you go. This will get a little messy, but it's just sand and water. It's nothing too bad. All right, so what we're going to do first is I'm going to show you how I built my stream table. Super simple. So the important thing in why we're using our paint trays here is that there's actually already an inclined surface here. So we have an inclined plane, which is allowing there to be a higher elevation and a lower elevation. So in our, let me zoom in a little bit, in our tray, our upstream is going to be at the top of our ramp. Our water is going to be able to naturally flow downstream regardless of how we build our channel, and the mouth is going to empty into this larger basin down here. So our basin can again represent just a larger body of water, whether we want to call that a lake, a larger river, or an ocean. So we're going to place our dry sand in our paint tray. I'll scoot these over this way so you can watch me pour it a little better. And right now our sand is totally dry, and I'm going to show you why we actually need to wet or moisten our sand before we build our river. Just a second. Now I'm only pouring my sand up on the ramp, and this is important. We don't want to fill the whole tray with sand because remember, down here in our basin, this is just going to hopefully be water and then some other special landforms that we're going to watch form as we run our experiments. And if it's covered in sand, we won't be able to see those observations as well. So I'm just going to kind of smooth out my sand across the ramp. Now, this looks nice and this is great, but if I try to build my meandering channel with my finger, hopefully you can see the difference between my already wet damp sand compared to my dry sand channel. Now I used my same finger, the same pressure to build my channel, but you can see here in the dry sand, there's no cohesion to the grains of sand here. So none of the grains of sand are sticking together. And this is not ideal because we want to build our channel as if it's an established river system. So water is going to want to naturally flow along that channel. If our grains are not stuck together and we can't build a really good channel, our water is just going to want to go anywhere at once on top of our stream table here, which is not the goal yet. Until we actually want to model flooding, we want the water to stay confined into the river channel. So how we do this, super simple. You just take a little bit of water and we're just going to pour a little bit at a time to cover our sand. Now you can see we're going to have to kind of mix it together. And just like I said earlier, the best texture, and you'll know it when you feel it, is when you have perfect sand castle building sand, okay? And this is getting there. We still have some dry spots, so you want to try to make it as homogeneous or as wet all over as possible. But again, you don't want to add too much water because if you do, then all of our sand, it's just like if you dumped a tub of water on top of your sand castle's just going to fall apart, okay? So this looks pretty good, and if we'll experiment in a minute building the river channel, and if it doesn't, then we can always go back and change it. And the beauty of this is you don't have to get it right the first time. If your sand is too dry, you just add a little bit more water. If your sand is too wet, we just add more dry sand and mix it in. So this feels pretty good. I'm going to kind of wipe my hands off here. And we're going to start from the mouth, or excuse me, the source, our water source, which is up near us at the top of the ramp. And we want our first part of the river channel to be straight, okay? Now, this is because, for the purposes of this model, a limitation is that the water has a tendency to want to pool up at the top right where the source of water is coming from, okay? So we want to create our river channel going straight, and then we're going to create our meanders. Remember, those are our U-shaped bends in our river system, okay? So in the case of my channel here, I have one nice meander, okay? Which is perfect for the purposes of this experiment. We're just going to explore one meander. All right, and we'll talk a little bit later about how you can scale these models and explore some other conditions, but for now, we're just going to stay to one. So, if we look back at our parts of the river, or our stream, remember our channel, sorry this is a little messy, our channel is the area where our water is flowing, so here is our channel, okay? And right now, our channel looks just like this sketch model that I have here. It's a nice, perfectly symmetrical U-shaped channel that will eventually be holding some water, okay? So the next thing that we need to create and build along our river system are our levees. Okay, so remember these are the high elevation areas on either side of our river system that are formed during flooding events. So the reason these are higher elevation than the floodplains is because right when water begins to flood and overflow our levees is where it has the most energy relative to once it reaches out on the floodplains and opens up into our flat area. Okay, oops, there we go. So it has the most energy up here. So it's going to be able to carry really big pieces of sediment and a lot of it, all right? As it loses energy very quickly, that sediment is going to be settled out or deposited. Remember, I said those words earlier, erosion and deposition. We'll get to that in a minute. But they're going to be deposited or laid down right closest to the river. As our water moves out toward the floodplains and the open flat land, remember it loses energy really fast. So the only types of sediment that are going to make it out there are going to be that mud, silt, and sand, those finer grained sediments. So a lot of sediment gets built up along either side of the river system, and that's why. So we're going to go in and build our levees, which is pretty fun. So the way I like to do it is just go on in and actually use your fingers to just kind of pinch, gently pinch on either side along your channel. Okay, and we're going to go the whole way. Now, if you're like me and you loved playing in the sand and the dirt and the mud as a kid, I think you're really going to enjoy this glorified sandbox experiment that we have. It's very fun. And you don't want to pack these down too tight, but you can go on in and kind of clean it up and make them look really good. Our nice levees. You want to try your best to keep it pretty uniform, okay? We're going to start with the most ideal, simple river system to begin with before we model our different flooding conditions, to see how these levees may change, how the river may change, and what landforms are created, and how that might affect people living nearby. Okay, those look pretty good. Now, on either side of our levees, remember, are our floodplains. Oops, there we go. Are our floodplains. And in our model, this looks pretty good, right? Our floodplains are relatively flat, low-lying areas on either side of our levees. That's exactly what we have here. There is an overall slope downhill to the basin, but this looks pretty good. I'm actually going to narrow my channel up here. I made it a little too wide. There we go. Awesome. So here's our river. So both of these look pretty similar. This one's going to appear a little bit more wet because I've actually ran some experiments on it already. But we'll get to it in just a minute. But we're going to start with the one I just created. And what we want to do is, again, get our beaker of water with our pointed little spout that can direct the water in the direction that we want it to go. We're just going to gently start to fill our river channel from the source. Hopefully you guys can see this on the video, but as I pour, you can start to see water flowing downstream, down our channel. Okay, this is exactly what we want to see. Now I'm pouring the water relatively slowly, and I'm doing that on purpose because what I'm doing here is just modeling normal stream conditions. I don't want my river to flood yet. I want to see what's happening in the river on a regular day. Now, what you might notice, I'm going to put my water down, is up near the source of water where I'm pouring, hopefully you guys can see it, the stream channel is widening, all right, which is technically a function of my water kind of spilling out. So this isn't really modeling closest to the source what would really happen in a river system, but that's just a limitation of the model in our stream table, which is okay. And so you might have to come in and kind of repair. Now, we can already start to see some landforms and some different processes happening inside of our river system, which is pretty awesome. So hopefully you guys can see already on the screen here. I'm going to try to lift it up. That should be good. Okay, so our water had flowed through our river channel, and what we can see is our water, just like we said, is going to travel all the way down the channel into our basin. And into our basin, that water is going to start to collect because it's a large area with a lot of volume that you can fill a lot of water into. As we run this experiment longer and longer, we'll see more water collect down at the mouth. But something that we noticed here is, remember, I didn't have any sand. Push that back. I didn't have any sand down in my basin when I began this experiment. But now I start to see a landform or some sort of deposit of sand down at the mouth of my river system. This is actually the formation of a delta. So many of you in DFW or in Texas are probably familiar with deltas because if you're familiar with the Gulf of Mexico, one of the largest deltas in the world is the Mississippi River Delta. And how deltas form is exactly how we just modeled. So I'm actually going to fill up my beaker a little bit more with water. We're going to run this experiment again so I can show you how more sand is going to be deposited into our delta. And I'll lift it up once I'm all finished to show you again. So for now, we'll take note what our delta looks like now. And we'll see if it changes as I run more water through our channel. And again, this is normal conditions. I'm not trying to flood my channel. I'm just lightly pouring some water down to enough for it to start flowing. So this is pretty cool. So I'm going to let the water flow out a minute. And we actually can see a lot of different changes happening, which is going to be pretty awesome. So what you can probably already see before I lift it up, I'm just giving it a second for the water to kind of flow out and start moving, or stop moving, excuse me. What you've probably noticed is that our river channel that I built is actually changing shape. So if we go back to our screen here, our first experiment, our river looked like this. Okay. With my levees on either side. After I ran water through it the second time, we see it got a little wider, okay? It got wider because sand is actually being eroded or picked off of the sides of our river channel and being carried downstream. Now we're going to examine the areas of erosion and deposition with inside of our channel in just a minute. But in general, our water is actually carving a wider channel as it's flowing, okay, which is super important. So our channels can change shape, all right? They can change shape, they can change paths, and they can change direction. So if we go back to our model here, our stream table, I can lift up and you can start to see our delta had moved quite a bit. Now this is going to be harder and harder to lift up because now our sand at the base in our basin, at the most downstream part of our river, is getting pretty saturated. And remember, when our sand gets saturated, it doesn't have any cohesion to it, so it doesn't want to stick together. But our delta got bigger, and it actually has two lobes to it now. So our first experiment, we had a little bit of sand get deposited at the mouth, okay? This is our little baby delta. Now, after experiment number 2, more sand got carried down the stream or down our channel. We have our original lobe, but then it also created a bigger one, okay, that went out even further into the mouth of our river. And this is how deltas grow. All right, so why is this happening? Well, if we go back to the same process of why our levees and our floodplains form, is as water loses energy or slows down, it decreases its velocity, it doesn't have energy to carry sediment with it anymore. So what's happening is our river channel, just like our hose into our pool, our hose is a confined space. Our water is moving pretty fast relative to our basin down our channel. Once it enters into that large body of water, all of that energy is lost. So that sediment that was traveling with the water down the channel now doesn't have anything to keep carrying it along, so it just gets deposited or dropped out of suspension. It just gets dropped where it is. So where the water loses its energy, that sediment gets left behind. Now, the tiniest pieces of sediment are fine-grained mud-sized sediment, is what's going to get carried out into the oceans, to the deepest parts of the ocean, because there is still deposition in these deep areas where there's really low velocity water. So water that's not moving very fast at all. And this is because those pieces of sediment are so small, it doesn't require a lot of energy to carry those along the ocean currents. So once those get deposited, that's why we see shales and mudstones being formed at the base of large bodies of water or large marine environments, because those are the low energy sediments that get settled out and eventually compress and compact into rock. So if you've ever seen a shale or a mudstone before, that rock likely formed at the base of a large body of water, whether it was an ocean or a really big lake, which is pretty cool. So again, these two experiments that we just did are actually just normal water conditions. I wasn't pouring my water really fast. I was trying my best to let it trickle out of the beaker pretty slowly and steady, just so enough water would flow through the channel. My goal was to not break my levees or to have any flooding on either side of the levees. I didn't want to breach my levees. I didn't want to fill my channel yet with too much water than it could hold. But now I do. Okay, so now we're going to model what happens. Oops. We're going to model what happens as we increase the amount of water. There we go. We're going to model what happens as we increase the amount of water flowing through our channel. So hopefully you all can see this. And we'll do this experiment a couple times since I have a backup here. But I'll still use the one that we've been using. So again, I'm going to rebuild my levees up at the top real quick because I don't want flooding to happen up here just because that's where I'm pouring the water. Okay, so we're going to build those up. And then I'm going to start letting my water flow. So I'm going to fill up my beaker a little bit. We're just going to watch what happens. Okay. Now students are going to have a lot of fun with this one because every kid likes destruction. All right. We all know that. So I'm going to have my water start to flow. I'm going to start pouring it a lot more. And I'm going to stop once I see a big change. Hopefully you guys all saw that on the screen. We had a big change. Yes.
Okay, let me see if it's on that same page or if it started a new one.
Now no one's watching.
No one's watching now. But hey, this is
That's
good
okay.
science.
How many people were watching?
At any given point, 6 to 8.
Really?
Yep, you're back.
That's shocking. Okay, okay, cool.
You're back.
I'm
so-
on.
Yay.
Okay. Someone's watching. It's you. Okay. Let's see. Sorry, friends. There we go. Let me get these set up again. Oops. Well, that's not what I wanted. One. Oops. Okay. Okay, I'm back. Thanks, Mary. All right, we're back. Hopefully some of you came back to join. Uh-oh, looks like it's red again, but maybe that just means it's live. Okay, I'm going to keep talking though because it doesn't look like I am frozen like the last time. So if you were following along and you saw just to the end, the most exciting part, I remember I increased my water velocity coming from my source, so I wanted my stream to flood. We were waiting and waiting and waiting for something to happen. We were looking for a big change before I stopped pouring the water, which luckily happened apparently right before I cut out. So hopefully you guys all got to see the live change. But we can see our levee, one of our levees broke. All right, it broke and the river actually changed direction completely. It abandoned part of the river system that it was originally flowing through and created a whole new channel, okay, because so much water was flowing through it. So we're going to come back up here and sketch what we just saw. So remember, our first flooding conditions, or our non-flooding conditions, water was just flowing naturally. We had deposition down here at the base of or at the mouth of our river. We had our delta growing and different lobes were forming. But as more and more water flowed through, so we have our original channel, okay? Then I'm going to sketch in the new channel with dashed lines. So our levee broke pretty much right here. So water was flowing through, and our new channel in our new delta started forming. So this was our original delta. Our new channel and our new delta formed right where the levee broke, okay? So if we're looking at a meander, I'm just going to draw one right here as an example. There's two sides to a meander, okay? There's an outside and then an inside. And depending on which side of the meander you're on, your water is going to be flowing different velocities, okay? So the physics inside of our river channel are actually really dynamic, and they change depending on what side of the river your water is flowing. So just by our first flooding experiment, we can hypothesize what side of a meander water flows the fastest. So what side of the meander our water velocity is the highest. So if we're looking at our meander here, this is the flip side of the one I drew here. So our outside, inside. So here is the outside, and here is the inside of this meander that eventually had a levee break. Our outside of the meander is where the levee broke first, okay? So this is where the levee broke. And we can see that here in our experiment, we can see this is where our levee broke first, okay? So the water was moving the fastest around the outside of our meander. On the inside of a meander is where our water is flowing slower with a lower velocity, okay? Now that's really important, especially when we're talking about where along a river channel should we live, okay? So what I'm going to do is we're actually going to switch to this experiment here, or my pre-made stream table, and I'm going to add some houses to it. Okay, now these can represent a lot of different things. I'm going to place one on the outside of a meander. I'm going to place one on the inside of a meander, and then I'm also just going to place one like pretty downstream. Okay, so kind of further away from a lot of the action. So out on the floodplain, and we're going to see what happens. So I'm going to pour some more water in my beaker. We're going to watch what happens. I'm going to build up my levees again because this has been sitting for a little while. I don't want my flooding to happen up near the source. So I'm going to pour my water, get it flowing. This one might take a little while, but we can see the more water that flows through, you can see more erosion happening on the outside of this meander. Okay, you can see the levee falling into the channel. You can see big chunks of sediment getting sent around, and sand is actually being deposited along the inside of this meander. And there's actually a word for these two features that I'm going to define for you in just a second. So I'm just going to let it go, let the water go. And we can see our yellow house, which originally wasn't too close to the levee, is now basically falling into the channel. Okay, our levee has eroded back so much and our channel has widened in this direction so much because of that high velocity of water along that bend. Now, the reason that we have higher velocity around the outside of the curve or outside of the meander is the same reason why if you're in a car and you're driving and you take a sharp turn, your body gets flung to the outside of that turn. That's inertia, okay? So Newton's laws are happening right in here. So an object in motion wants to stay in motion till an outside force is acted upon it. So our water wants to flow in a straight line down our river channel. But because the bend in the channel forces it to move, that inertia is going to have a high velocity, or that water is going to have a lot of energy as it bends around the meander. So it's going to cut back into our levee on the outside of our channel, which actually was referred to a cut bank, okay? So our cut banks is the outside of a meander. The inside, as we saw here, is where sediment is being deposited, okay? This is called a point bar. And if you're ever flying in an airplane or you're looking at aerial photographs of different rivers, the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon or the Mississippi River are really two great examples in North America where you can see cut banks and point bars really, really nicely. In the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon, these point bars actually form big, beautiful beaches inside of the river system, inside of the canyon, that you can actually go sit on and put a chair on if you're rafting down the river. Okay, and that's because all of that water is moving so fast and cutting into the cut bank that the water on the inside of your meander doesn't have enough energy to carry the sediment anymore, so it just settles out. It's deposited. So erosion is happening on the outside or our cut bank, and our point bar is where we have the most deposition along with the mouth of our river system where deltas form. Now, the cool thing about this experiment, once we place our homes on it, we can try to examine each of these different houses that we placed and identify the different risks associated with each of them. So obviously our yellow house, which is built closest to the cut bank, is going to face some hazards associated with that cut bank continuously being eroded away, even during normal conditions. So remember, we saw our river channel widening between our first and second experiment when our water velocity was pretty low in general and just normal flowing conditions. So that cut bank is always going to be eroding, okay? Now, our friend in the blue over here that was built closest to our point bar is sitting pretty right now, okay? Because over here we have more and more sediment being deposited. Our point bar is growing. So in theory, our blue house is doing pretty well, but we'll talk about what risks they might face here in just a second. Now, our friend down living on the floodplain, a little bit closer to the beach, isn't really affected by anything happening in our channel, but as we're closer to this larger body of water, as more water is entering into our basin, the water level is rising. Our water or our sand is becoming saturated, and my red paperclip or my house is actually sunk a little bit. Okay, so that is a risk. Now, if we think back to our first couple experiments, we saw that our river changed direction. Okay, so even if, say, we had a house sitting down here, which would be on the point bar location, in our river system closest to the basin or our large body of water, you would hypothesize that that house would be sitting pretty. It would be fine until a levee breaks, okay? Which is really important and gets back to our blue friend over here. Even if you're building a house near the point bar or the inside of a meander, you still risk an upstream levee breaking and flooding your nice pretty area with your farm and your garden and all of that. So most places along a river system really are at risk for a lot of these different hazards, even if you're far away on the floodplain. Because remember, how do floodplains form? They flood. They wouldn't exist without flooding. So we know that because a floodplain exists, that it's likely going to flood again. Okay? And these are things that city engineers and city geologists are always thinking about and always examining, re-examining, making assessments about, and how they engineer and structure and build cities and where people live. Okay? So that is all I have for our stream table experiment, and it is noon on the dot. So if you guys have any questions about how I run this experiment, what you saw today, ways that you can make it different in your classroom, or if you would like, a quick idea actually that I brought, I'll show you in just a second. Let me zoom out, is if you want to explore rivers with more meanders, because what we have here is a pretty narrow tray, okay? It's not very long. We can only build so many tight meanders in here before the physics of what's happening inside of the channel isn't really going to represent what's happening in real life as well. So we don't really want to build our channels super tight like this, because our water, with how we're going to have to be pouring it and how we have to build our levees, it's just going to barrel right through it. So we really don't want to make too tight of meanders in this model with our paint trays. But you can also buy longer, more narrow, or larger trays, even large Tupperware bins that are maybe a little shallow. Like if you have something that you fit stuff under your bed for storage, you can take one of those out, fill it with sand, and create a larger stream table model where you can have multiple meanders in one experiment and see what happens downstream as more and more water flows. So that's where you're going to be able to see the effects of folks living closer to the point bar or the inside of a meander, or what happens to people living on the outside of a meander on the cut bank that maybe the cut bank didn't actually erode the levee next to it. It's actually building a bigger levee, protecting that house even more. So there's a lot of different unpredictable sometimes dynamics that can happen inside of our river system that you can model really well with longer river channels and more meanders, which is super fun. And a really cool experiment for kids to really inquire and make their own observations and build their own experiment. So the way I ran this experiment today, I chose exactly where I wanted my meanders to be. They could have looked a little differently. I could have had them going in different directions. I could have experimented with different shapes and sizes and widths of my channels, different saturation of sand. And the cool thing is as your water fills up, you can always pour it out. And as your sand gets more wet, you can always add more sand. And if you don't like an experiment that you did or you want to try something else, you literally just smooth it out and then you start over, okay? So it's a really foolproof experiment that you can test a lot of different variables that model things that are actually happening in the real world. And the cool thing is you can take those observations and create engineering projects out of it. So maybe they've experimented the earth systems and the earth processes of erosion and deposition and different landforms with our stream table. And then their challenge is to build a man-made levee, like most of the levees here in Dallas. The really, really big levees, like down near downtown, along the walking paths that the bridges go over. You can see these really, really, really tall levees that are man-made, and they're made to be bigger than what would naturally form along the Trinity River. That way to protect the big city and all of these people that live here, and infrastructure and roads and highways that if they were to be severely flooded, like what almost happened a few years ago when the Trinity River, during the summer, there were so many days of rain that the Trinity River got pretty close to breaching its levees, even the man-made ones, which are built to withstand these super unlikely, low probability flooding conditions, okay? Now, like I said, this is a really fun experiment that students can get really into. They can create their own engineering design projects afterward to try to solve a problem. They can be assigned a different house and try to build and withstand the different flooding conditions and examine what would they do to that house specifically to make it more protected from a river, or would they move it, or how would they re-engineer or redesign the river system. There's a lot of different directions that you can take this experiment that all stems from our DIY stream table here. So I hope you guys learned some cool stuff and had some fun exploring. And I hope you guys get a chance to make one of these because, like I said, it's a glorified sandbox and it's super fun. So send us an email if you have any questions. If you're watching this and you would like some hours for or PD hours for your STEM Institute credits, don't forget to fill out the survey that's going to be posted on Edmodo. With your reflections and your observations from the video today. But if you have any specific questions, don't hesitate to send me an email at samantha.dupnick@perotmuseum.org or our teacher workshops at perotmuseum.org email address. I'm happy to answer them for you, and I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks. Now let's see if I can turn it off.